Chapter 20. Cherries, beets, tomatoes, and thyme. In junior high school, I had a friend named Dinky. Of course, that wasn't his real name. His given name was Charles Larson, but somewhere he'd got the name Dinky, and that's what everyone called him. There were two really important things about him. One was his eyes, which were like a cat's oval instead of round, and amber green. The other was his Aunt Ruth. I'm glad I remember her, because she was a special presence in my life. Dinky and his parents lived with her in a house about 10 minutes from ours, although I rarely saw them. They both worked. I think his father was a carpenter or a cabinet maker. Dinky and I ran into each other at school occasionally, but what stands out in my mind more clearly are the summers, when Dinky seasonally got poison oak on the bottoms of his feet, with blisters so big and oozing that he couldn't walk. I hung out at his house then to keep him company. We were either in his backyard under the weeping willow tree, or in the cool, dark cellar, which was filled with fruits and vegetables Aunt Ruth had canned. Canning was totally foreign to me. It was not part of my heritage, so far as I knew, and I was intrigued by the process and the rows and rows of neatly labeled jars on the shelves Dinky's father had built. Once in a while, Aunt Ruth had to pierce the blisters on his feet and drain and dress them. It was messy and painful, and I felt glad I was there to provide some comforting for my friend. Afterwards, we'd be allowed to open one of the jars of pickled beets, which were delicious, and on which we gorged addictively. One day at school, Dinky got into a fight with one of the other kids. He put his fists up, manfully, thumbs tucked inside, and everyone yelled, "Get your thumbs out, stupid, or you could break 'em." I yelled too, to be one of the crowd, and after that, things were never the same between me and Dinky. And there were no more pickled beets. It was wartime in the early 40s. Like many others, we had small victory garden in the backyard. The sight of my immaculate father hoeing in the dirt and trying to stay immaculate always amused me. Some things grew very well, some not at all. What really grew were green tomatoes. I thought they were a special kind, not knowing that they were simply green before they ripened. We were going to take the train from Washington across the river to Boston to visit my aunt and uncle, my cousins, and my bubby, who lived with them. My father dragged an old flimsy suitcase from a closet shelf, loaded it with green tomatoes he'd carefully selected from the garden, and tied it up with a piece of clothesline. We carried it, along with our other luggage and my brother Roy's toilet seat, onto the train, and thus we arrived in Boston. There, in due course, the purpose of transporting the tomatoes became apparent when Bubby promptly pickled them. And as the tart, delicious slices were set before me, and I dug in, I thought of Dinky, and of Aunt Ruth's pickled beets. The first summer Deborah and I were married, between my junior and senior years in college, I had 2 jobs. I worked for the Hayward Recreation Department in the Bay Area for part of the summer, visiting 32 playgrounds and teaching dramatics. The rest of the time I worked at the S&W Cannery in nearby Redwood City. That was customary summer work for many students, but not for me. For me, it was something I was totally unprepared for. The cannery was huge, with high ceilings, mountains of machinery, coils of conveyor belts, and piles of wooden pallets. It was cherry season, and my job was dumping cherries. With a handcart, I leaned in to hurry to the stacks of pallets, which carried heavy cherry-filled barrels, load a pallet on the cart, rush back to the conveyor belt, scoop out the cherries from the barrels with a 2-handed scoop, and dump them onto the conveyor belt, where, from either side, girls and elderly women picked out the rotten fruit and disposed of it as the belt moved along. Then I'd trundle off with the pallet of empty barrels, stack them with the others, and hustle for another pallet of full barrels. The cherries were soaked in sulfur, and the barrels were big. When you neared the bottom with the scoop, your head and shoulders were inside the barrel, and the fumes were overpowering. But you couldn't slow down or stop because the conveyor belt kept moving. Shades of Lucille Ball's famous candy conveyor belt sequence. And the women quickly became impatient if you delayed the flow of cherries. The foreman was lean and short and spent most of his time scrambling around on the equipment, high above us, looking down like the king of the mountain. I thought the symbolism was obvious, but no one else got it. They were simply preoccupied with their jobs. Eventually, I did so well at the temporary part-time job that the foreman climbed down to the floor, took me aside, and asked if I'd like to work there permanently, full-time. Not wanting to offend him, I politely declined, because of school. A good friend among my fellow workers was a fine-looking young Mexican who read comic books on our breaks and talked lovingly of his wife and kids. He worked 3 jobs to support them: the cannery, at a dairy farm milking cows in the late afternoons, and in frozen food plant at night. I admired him for that and told him so, and he gave me rides home on his motorcycle. Deborah was a little taken aback when we rode up to our small duplex on the wrong side of town, and by the gang markings tattooed on his knuckles, which she spotted when they shook hands. Once he invited us to join him at a club some weekend. We hesitated for a moment, then responded that we looked forward to meeting his wife, but he just laughed at us. He didn't go out with his wife. She stayed home with the kids. He devoted weekends to his girlfriend. Somehow, our double date never materialized. Cherries, beets, tomatoes, part of the taste and texture of a lifetime. Those were good and happy years when I think back on them, and how great it would be to know that by now Dinky's poison oak is gone, and he's finally learned to take his thumbs out of his fists.